wanted to say that, you know, we're happy that you're all here, and I was just sharing about what we're about and what we hope to do. And we're only 1 year old, a 1 year old organization that has been doing great things. We have several webinars within this 1 year, and we attracted a number of scholars and interest, and we receive emails, just so you know, by individual established scholars that want to be part of this organization and want to promote their research. So we're happy with the work that we're doing. All of us were working pretty much full time, but it's for free, because we believe in promoting African voice, especially in a context where we usually do not hear it. So right now, I'll invite the president if he wants to say something, and then we move forward with the program.
Yes, yes. Or you can just move forward to talk to them. That won't be better. Just proceed towards the screen. Towards the screen.
Towards the screen.
Yeah, let me see.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad that we are gathered here today. I have had the pleasure of meeting the people here for the very first time. We have always communicated online, obviously, but it's really great to be here in my house with all of these people. Augustine and Mukile have worked very, very hard over the last 2 days, actually, to get all of this together. So it is a little bit disappointing that some of the people that we thought would be here are not here. They said they would be here, but they're not here. But nevertheless, we have had a good time. We're enjoying very good food and drink, of course, not to miss that out. But now we're getting down to the serious business of the webinar. And we look forward to hearing from our speakers. And also thank you to Yokiam for being the moderator for this webinar session. I don't want to say too much. I don't want to delay the program, so I'll hand over back to Yokiam. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And thank you for hosting some of our members. We hope in the future it will be bigger and the food looks delicious. Now, I would like to invite our Blessing. Thank you so much for your willingness to read the bios of our guest speakers. So if you could go ahead and introduce our first guest speaker, that would be good.
All right. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all.
Yes, nice to meet you too.
Okay, so I'll start with Dr. Tara Mock. She's an assistant professor in the Honors College of the University of Alabama, United States. Professor Mock comes to the Honors College from Bowdoin College in Brunswick, Maine, where she was a visiting assistant professor of Africana Studies and an affiliated faculty member in Asian Studies. Her research and teaching interests include modern African-China relations, diaspora, cultural identity and community formation, visuality, globalization, and historical memory. Dr. Monk earned her PhD in African American and African Studies at the Michigan State University. Prior to MSU, that's Michigan State University, Professor Monk had studied international business at HEC Paris, received a master's in law and diplomacy in international communication and international political economy from the Fletcher School of Tufts University, and earned a Bachelor of Arts in the history of non-Western developing nations at Louisiana State University. Dr. Mock is currently working on a book combining multimodal research methods with theories of diaspora, emerging community, and cultural political economy to situate her investigation into conceptualization of selfhood and order between African and Chinese people within an Africana Studies framework. Dr. Monk is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana.
Thank you so much. No, you read it after the next person. Thank you so much for reading that, Blessing. It's good to meet you, by the way, for the first time in via and
Yeah.
Dr. Tara, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, so thank you. I am very honored to be here. I appreciate the very nice introduction. So thank you, Blessing, and also the invitation to be here from the African Researchers Network. So I know that time is limited, so I'll try to get right into it as we attempt to interrogate the precise nature of Africa-China relations and the question of whether it's one that's rooted in neoliberal capitalism or perhaps is more reflective of an asymmetrical power relationship rooted in some form of coloniality. Let's see. All right. So the renewed relationship between the vast majority of the African states across the width and the breadth of the continent and the People's Republic of China within the last 30 plus years has really spurred a fairly polarizing debate regarding the precise nature of what the relationship is and how it bodes for the people and spaces across the continent. Although there are a number of different viewpoints of precisely what that relationship is, they can really be distilled down into three particular lenses through which China's involvement on the continent is typically viewed through. One being that of a time trusted friend and partner. And this is typically one that appeals to people for whom they remember and rely on this idea of a relationship during the decolonial period, during the Maoist solidarity era. There are also those who view it through the lens of competition between fledgling African industries, or more mature African industries and African traders and Chinese industries and traders who are making their way to the continent. And then there's also a view of the relationship as being colonial. And it's this last view of the relationship that really sets the tone for the remainder of my presentation this morning, where I attempt to provide a framework for exploring Africa-China relationships that really rests on this question of whether or not it is colonial in nature. So as we move into the question, I think it's important to start with a shared understanding of exactly what colonialism is, not simply what we believe it is or what we've heard it was like, but what it really is as a system itself. And so I want to start with a quote by Aimé Césaire, who in Notes on Colonialism stated that between colonizer and colonized, there is room only for domination and submission, which turned the colonizing man into a classroom monitor, an army sergeant, a prison guard, a slave driver, and the indigenous man into an instrument of production. So we can see within this quote that there is clearly an asymmetrical relationship, right? So one group possesses power, the other is dispossessed of power. And in that, it reflects an air of dominance, which Césaire himself speaks to. And so when we think about colonialism, it's a system of domination. And this domination manifests itself in a number of different ways, whether that be through land occupation or labor exploitation or cultural dominance, which is rather insidious, but perhaps one of the most significant means of this domination, and also resource diplomacy or resource dependency, excuse me. But within this, what's most important is through all of these forms of dominance, the sovereignty of the individual nations is stripped in a number of different ways. I also think it's important to bear in mind that when we think about colonialism, it's important to note that it isn't unique to Africa. All right, so African states and people weren't the only ones who've been historically colonized, but the corollary is that it also isn't unique only to sort of this Euro-American system. What is consistent, however, is this idea that it's always been completed in pursuit of some form of global capital accumulation. And the colonial system has helped to facilitate the accumulation of that capital in a number of different ways, whether it be during the 16th century as maritime technology developed and enabled ships to traverse the globe, or whether it be during the 19th century as military technology developed, which enabled the creation of the Maxim gun, which helped to facilitate the takeover of the African continent. What's important is that these technologies help to enable and facilitate the system, making it possible to move large numbers of people across the ocean and to maintain political sovereignty over those people, despite the fact that there is some geographical dispersion. So it's, in a sense, it enables ruling from afar, but it also enables rule over the domestic populations internally. It's also important to note that colonialism doesn't simply happen in one way. There's not simply one form. So when we're thinking about whether this is colonialism or not, there are many different ways in which the system might manifest itself. It might be through settler colonialism, which we're probably familiar with, largely in Anglophone nations, but it might be through planter colonialism, where there's a focus on a single crop, or extractive colonialism, where raw materials are the principal focus. So what I want to get across about this system is that colonialism is dynamic, it's changing, it's multifaceted, and it's multidimensional. But despite that, there are a number of different arenas in which the colonial project, as we know it, has been fairly consistent. And it's to those that I'd like to turn my attention for the remaining minutes that I have with you today. So what I'd like to do is really think about the way in which the colonial project was enacted in Africa by Euro-American states, and then in turn map those sort of ways of enacting the system onto the Chinese state in particular, as a way of creating a framework for discussing it. So if we think about colonialism within the political arena, we might associate the balkanization of African states, or the creation of arbitrary boundaries that serve to separate ethnic groups and brought others into the sense of an anomalous familiarity where there was none prior to that. There's also the ongoing threat of sovereignty of the people themselves, which is enacted in a number of different ways, whether it be indirectly or directly through settler colonialism, or more tangentially through the creation of trading outposts in particular areas. But there's always the use of force, or the threat of force, as a means of controlling the indigenous populations. If we think about this within the framework of Africa-China relations, we know that there is no sort of balkanization of spaces that we're aware of. When we think about the threat to sovereignty, there are particular levers of control that are being utilized, particularly as it relates to economic might, to influence decision-making amongst certain leaders, but this isn't pervasive across the continent, at least now that we know. But one area in which it is in respect to the requirement of the One China policy as being a requirement for diplomatic relations with China. If we think about strategies of engagement, China is, well, I won't say adheres to, but they stand behind this idea of the 5 no policy, which is akin to the 5 principles of mutual coexistence, which underpins, according to the Chinese, their relationship with the people and spaces across the continent. And this is important because China's involvement on the continent is not simply outward facing, but it's also about their relationship with the people domestically, whom they need to maintain support for their involvement in spaces like Africa, but also in Latin America and other spaces in Asia. And this is important because one of the most significant aspects of China's geopolitical goals is to restore its place globally as a part of what it refers to as a new world order that decenters the United States and European powers, but in turn, and in replacement of that, it centers China with Latin American countries, and in particular, African nations in support of that move. So there's a new world order that's China-centered. When we think about the use of force, we can also, again, refer to the One China policy, but also the tendency to exert influence in local political arenas. We've seen this in spaces like Zimbabwe, Angola, Zambia, and also Kenya in recent elections. Very quickly, militarily, in terms of the Euro-American sort of colonial complex, we know that there was a military superiority or force projection. This often manifested itself within naval technology, which helped to facilitate control of the seas, and also exploration and capture of communities other than their own. This use of force was also underpinned by technological developments, as I mentioned, such as the Maxim gun, but there was also the industrial production capacity, where there was a capacity to constantly reproduce these means of control. If we look at this from the Chinese perspective, militarily, there is a base that exists in Djibouti. So there's a conversation regarding whether this is a military base or not, but the Chinese present this as a logistical facility, one that's designed to promote anti-piracy in the region, to gather intelligence, evacuation if there need be, and peacekeeping. There's also, and this goes into the question of the use of force, because one of the purposes of the facility is to ensure security of Chinese citizens and companies on the continent and within the region if there is a need to evacuate or provide peacekeeping. So this again goes to the question of sovereignty of the nations, if the Chinese logistical facility is going to utilize military in this way. It's also important to consider this facility because of how it bodes for industrial production capacity across the continent. It's referred to as the first pearl of a necklace, meaning it's the very first facility of its type. And we know that there are other facilities that are in various stages of development in places like Tanzania, Angola, and across the Gulf of Guinea. Economically, I think we're probably most familiar with the economic components of colonialism, whether it be the new goods market, which facilitates the export of manufactured goods to the colony, and not allowing the colonies themselves to develop and strengthen their industries, raw material extraction, the export of surplus labor to the colony, and the enslavement or compulsion of local people to actually work on behalf of the colony. And then finally, the lack of investment in the social and infrastructure of the colony, the lack of integration between systems in the colony. So if we look at this from the perspective of Chinese activity across the continent, we can see some similarities, but also important differences. So one is that Africa represents an expanding market to which China can export its cheap manufactured goods. That's true, but it's a small market from the perspective of the Chinese state. Their major market is the United States. Another major market is the European Union. And so the African markets aren't particularly important when we think about them in context. But what is important is that these cheap manufactured goods that are being exported to the continent are in direct competition with local goods. They're in direct competition with local industries. And so it presents a problem from that perspective. When we consider raw materials extraction, there's not the same type of relationship in that respect, but it's similar in that resource diplomacy underpins many of the investments by the Chinese. And so, yes, they build pipelines and highways and railways. Some of those are by virtue of grants, but many of them are underpinned by resources, by the future wealth of many of these nations. And so it's a very nuanced way of looking at the resource extraction, but it's an important way of considering it. Surplus labor is also important because much of the conversation regarding the Chinese, particularly as it involves their infrastructure projects and their construction, has to do with the fact that those construction projects are accompanied by many Chinese laborers who are brought to the continent. And so African states and their people, again, are used as cheap sources of labor because they're often relegated to less significant, more grunt level work in these projects, though some of that is starting to change. And then finally, development aid. We know that Chinese aid operates very differently than sort of Euro-American aid projects. One important difference is that there is no conditionalities levied in terms of the ways in which the aid is dispensed. And this enables many states across the continent to actually develop infrastructure projects that are meaningful to them in terms of pipelines and highways and railways. There are some concerns with that as well, which we can get into in Q&A, but the tone and tenor of aid is very different. It's also important to note that aid is used as a power of attraction and influence. Attraction to the Chinese state, but influence of the Chinese state across the continent. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And then finally, it's important to note that these projects, as a result of their connection with sort of resources, creates heavy indebtedness to the PRC. All right. And so there's a question of what happens when these loans actually come to term. So finally, there's a question of cultural colonialism, cultural influence, and I think we're likely all familiar with this from the perspective of the Euro-American states. There are racial arguments that underpinned colonialism, thinking that people were less human, that they were uncivilized, and this helped to facilitate support of domestic audiences that underpin their movement across the continent. So when we think about this from the Chinese perspective, at the state level, we don't find that there are many racial arguments to support this, but we do regularly hear about one-on-one or company level interactions that lend one to question whether the Chinese possess a sort of Euro-normative construction of racial alterity regarding Africanity, but it also could be sort of a reflection of Chinese cultural universalism or particularism. So that's something to keep in mind. culturally, unlike, and this is probably the biggest point of distinction between the Euro-American sort of practice of colonialism and Chinese involvement on the continent, which is this cultural piece, which is quite different than what European powers have done previously, and that rests on the power of attraction. There's a rhetoric of sameness where there are comparisons drawn between Chinese and African nations and their relationships with the West, between their histories, their cultures, as a way of inculcating a particular image of China and its relationship with people and spaces across the continent. There's also a desire to create attraction to Chinese culture. And we see this through the institution of Confucius Institutes, as well as the Mandarin language in various countries across the continent. And this also helps to facilitate access in a very different way. So I'm going to conclude again by just asking the initial question of whether it replicates a colonial or neo-colonial relationship. And from my perspective, although there are some distinct and important similarities that could be reminiscent of the dynamic nature of global capital accumulation, and it could present a new form of colonialism, I think that there are enough differences where one might be able to say that it is an ism, but it's something distinctly new and different. And so from my perspective, one of the terms that I use because of that focus on sameness is something that I'm calling similarism. So the answer from my perspective would be that it's something in between, all right? Something that's as yet been defined, all right? So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tara, for such a great presentation. And by the way, our audience, we'll encourage you to put in, if you have a question in the chat, or just remember that you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions to our guest speakers. I appreciate the point that you highlight, Dr. Tara, on, even though you define the way you define colonialism, it sounds, based on your presentation, it sounds like as though there are elements indeed of what we are familiar with as colonialism with China-Africa relations. I look forward to our discussion. Now we're going to do the Q&A after all of our guests present their papers. And we encourage our audience to remember, to jot down questions that you may have for each of our guests. And then we will have, I look forward to a rich conversation with all of our guest speakers. So the next, Blessing, could you please read our next, the bio of our next speaker?
Okay. That's Dr. Ibrahima Niang. Dr. Ibrahima Niang holds a PhD in sociology from the University Cheikh Anta Diop of Dakar, Senegal. He has been a lecturer at the Department of Sociology for 8 years. His teaching focuses on African sociology and anthropology, economic sociology and international relations, and China's geopolitics in Africa. He is the founder of the Institute of African and Asian Studies based in Dakar. He has stayed extensively in China and was engaged in research at the Presidential Program, African China, and the School of Agriculture and Rural Development of the People's University of China. He holds a certificate in economic development from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Niang is the author and co-author of numerous scientific articles and reports on development issues and foresight, academic freedoms, migration, conflict, research governance, and epistemology on social movements. He was a fellow of Edinburgh African Studies Center in the United Kingdom and the African Peace Building Network of the Social Sciences Research Council. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at Human Lespad in the knowledge activism, focused on strengthening African publishing and dissemination by the Open Society Foundation.
Thank you, Blessing, for doing that. And we invite you, Dr. Ibrahim. And we also, just to also remind you that we do have a French translator, and that is one of our member, Brother Mukeli, who is also a PhD student and a translator. So he will be translating in French. Dr. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to join this panel, this very interesting panel on Africa-China relationships. So as my colleagues mentioned it, I have to give my talk in French, as we are a Pan-African organization, so we have to let all the African, even they are colonized language, we have to share all of these language to understand each other what we are talking. So let's go to the most important things is my talk. So for my talk, I will do it as my colleagues mentioned it in French.
Yeah.
Yes. So I will not share. Okay, I will not share a PPT. I have not a share with colleagues, and after that we can exchange around some points that I will raise during my talks.
Definitely. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, for doing that. And Brother Mukeli, are you on board? He's going to be translating from French to English to us.
Ok. Voilà. Merci beaucoup. Donc, à l'heure où la Chine et l'Afrique célèbrent cette année, c'est-à-dire l'année 2021, les 21 ans de l'établissement des relations entre la République populaire de Chine et les États africains autour du Forum de coopération Chine-Afrique qui a été créé en 2000 dans le but de favoriser un peu la coopération économique entre les deux parties.
Brother Dr. Ibrahim, could you wait for a moment? Pardon me for interrupting.
Okay.
We need Brother Mukeli on board, but I'm not sure whether he can hear me. Augustine? Yeah, he's supposed to be doing the translation. Okay. Pardon us, please. The other group, the members, some of our members are, as you can see, they are at a party celebrating our 1-year anniversary. So, you know, they're not as probably, the internet might be having problems there. Okay, yeah, you may go ahead, sir.
Okay.
You can read the captions, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. So, à l'heure où l'Afrique et la Chine célèbrent les 21 ans de l'établissement des relations entre les deux parties autour de cette plateforme qui est le Forum de coopération Chine-Afrique, qui a été créé pour favoriser un peu la coopération économique entre les deux parties. Il est important, comme vous le faites aujourd'hui, de faire le bilan d'étape de cette nouvelle forme de partenariat qui est marqué par des statistiques qui sont très importantes. Si nous regardons bien, en fait, les statistiques entre la Chine et le continent africain, on peut noter qu'il y a eu des avancées significatives dans les relations entre les deux parties. Car aujourd'hui, la Chine a dépassé les partenaires commerciaux traditionnels du continent, en devenant le premier partenaire commercial du continent africain à partir de 2009. Le commerce, si on regarde en fait les échanges commerciaux, le commerce entre les deux parties entre la République populaire de Chine et le continent africain, on a noté que le volume commercial est passé de 10 milliards de dollars en 2001 à 220 milliards en 2020. Alors, au niveau du stock des investissements de la Chine sur le continent, ça se situe à hauteur de 44,4 milliards de dollars. Mais c'est assez faible par rapport aux pays européens et aux États-Unis d'Amérique qui sont autour de 705 milliards de dollars. Nous constatons donc que la Chine essaie de rattraper son retard en termes d'investissement sur le continent africain. Mais aussi, il faut noter que la caractéristique la plus étonnante et la plus importante de l'engagement de la Chine sur le continent africain, c'est que la Chine aujourd'hui est sans doute le premier fournisseur du développement. Donc, au cours des 2 dernières décennies, c'est-à-dire les 20 ans qui marquent un peu le cadre de partenariat qui est le FOCA, la Chine a accordé des prêts d'un montant estimé à 148 milliards de dollars au continent africain. Donc, dépassant ainsi de loin tous les autres prêteurs traditionnels. Alors, c'est seulement en fait la Banque mondiale qui arrive à rivaliser en matière de prêts avec la République populaire de Chine. Alors, ce qu'on constate donc sur le plan économique, on retrouve aussi cela sur le plan académique, c'est-à-dire que cette dynamique des relations entre la République populaire de Chine et le continent africain se traduit aussi par une littérature très abondante. Et dans cette littérature-là, ce qu'on remarque, c'est qu'il y a une dichotomie, une sorte de ligne de partage entre les sino-optimistes et les sino-pessimistes. Alors, vous avez les sino-pessimistes qui considèrent que avec cette présence chinoise-là, nous allons assister à une nouvelle forme de colonisation. Et de l'autre côté, vous avez des sino-optimistes pour qui la Chine est un partenaire sur qui l'Afrique peut compter pour se projeter définitivement sur les rampes du développement. Alors c'est pourquoi les interrogations sur la présence chinoise en Afrique font l'objet d'une littérature très abondante qui charrie beaucoup de domaines de recherche, que ce soit les sciences politiques, les sciences humaines et sociales, l'histoire, l'anthropologie, les relations internationales. Donc, toutes ces disciplines ont cherché véritablement à comprendre cette présence chinoise-là. Et dans cette littérature-là, il y a une dimension qu'on considère comme étant une dimension qui a été fantasmée un peu sur cette présence chinoise-là. C'est pourquoi, en fait, la lecture africaine est importante dans les relations entre la République populaire de Chine et le continent africain. Pourquoi cette lecture africaine est importante? Parce que les auteurs africains ont été devancés sur cette question par les autres chercheurs des autres continents. Par conséquent, en fait, l'Afrique est précédée, le discours de la Chine et l'Afrique, c'est un discours qui est précédé par un autre discours. C'est-à-dire le discours africain est précédé par un autre discours, qui peut être un discours occidental ou un discours oriental. Par conséquent, ce qu'on constate, c'est que le sujet africain ou le chercheur africain et son objet doit aller dans le sens de reconquérir cet objet-là. C'est-à-dire que l'Afrique doit pouvoir être objet et aussi sujet du discours qui le concerne. À partir de ce moment, on arrive à dépasser un peu cette dichotomie entre sino-optimistes, sino-pessimistes, pour avoir des auteurs qui sont en quelque sorte des sino-lucides. c'est-à-dire des auteurs qui vont travailler à aller dans le sens d'une reconquête de l'initiative théorique. Donc, ainsi, en posant le débat sur la présence chinoise en Afrique, est-elle une nouvelle forme de colonisation ou une relation d'affaires? À mon avis, il faut analyser d'abord la nature de cette relation d'affaires pour voir si elle peut entraîner une nouvelle forme de dépendance. Car qu'il s'agisse de la République populaire de Chine ou des puissances anciennes ou des puissances qui sont considérées comme des puissances traditionnelles, les formes aujourd'hui qu'épouse la mondialisation économique, la gouvernance mondiale, entraînent déjà l'Afrique dans la dépendance. Et toute dépendance entraîne une perte de souveraineté. Donc la question que l'on se posera, c'est bien de savoir si la nature des relations économiques entre l'Afrique et la Chine peuvent conduire à une situation de dépendance, au point que certains États africains soient amenés à aliéner leur souveraineté du fait des accords signés avec la République populaire de Chine. À partir de ce moment, on essaie d'avoir des points sur lesquels, en fait, les relations entre la Chine et le continent africain sont axées. Et à ce niveau, il y a le secteur des investissements. Par exemple, à ce jour, on dénombre 10 000 entreprises chinoises qui sont présentes en Afrique. Donc, 10% de ces entreprises sont des SOE, c'est des State-Owned Enterprises, c'est des entreprises qui appartiennent à l'État chinois. Dans le secteur de la construction, par exemple, les entreprises publiques chinoises ont généré plus de 40 milliards de dollars de revenus annuels depuis 2012. Elles financent un projet sur 5, construisent un projet sur 3, ce qui fait aujourd'hui que la Chine est le plus grand acteur des infrastructures africaine. Alors, le problème qu'il y a à ce niveau concernant ces investissements-là, parce qu'on parle de souveraineté, on parle de relations d'affaires, on parle aussi de colonisation. À partir du moment où ce sont des prêts ou des financements chinois obtenus par les gouvernements africains pour la construction d'infrastructures, on se rend compte que les entreprises africaines ou les entreprises locales, selon les différents pays, sont exclues des appels d'offres. C'est-à-dire donc que les États africains empruntent de l'argent à la Chine, mais ce sont des entreprises chinoises qui exécutent ces constructions-là au profit des États africains. À partir de ce moment, donc, la question de la souveraineté se pose. La question aussi de l'aide ou de l'investissement qui est lié, c'est-à-dire j'accepte votre financement, mais je suis obligé de donner ce marché-là à une entreprise chinoise. Donc, si cette question de souveraineté se pose, qui sous-tend un peu l'idée de colonisation, il faut aussi interroger la part de responsabilité des États africains, parce que ce sont les États africains qui négocient à ce niveau, qui acceptent ces types de contrats. Je vais vous donner un exemple ici au Sénégal, où des amis à moi qui étaient impliqués dans les négociations avec le gouvernement sénégalais et la partie chinoise, il arrive des moments dans la négociation où on leur demande gentiment de sortir et de laisser les deux parties, que ce soit la partie chinoise et les membres du gouvernement, de finir les négociations. Ça veut dire que, quelque part aussi, il y a une absence de transparence dans ces marchés qui sont signés. Parce que si cela nécessite que le traducteur local puisse être sorti de la salle, ça veut dire qu'il y a des dessous de table, des pots de vin qui sont versés dans la plupart des marchés qui sont donnés. Autre secteur aussi qui pose problème dans ces relations-là et qui peut amener un peu à poser cette question de la colonisation, c'est qu'au niveau de ces entreprises-là, la justice sociale n'est pas très respectée. Dans la plupart des entreprises chinoises au Sénégal, vous allez vous rendre compte que le code du travail sénégalais qui fixe l'heure de travail à 8 heures est de manière très flagrante violée par des entreprises chinoises qui font travailler les salariés à 12 heures de travail par jour. Malheureusement, l'État ne prend pas les mesures nécessaires pour rectifier cela. Autre point qui pose un peu le débat sur est-ce que c'est une relation d'affaires ou une forme de colonisation, c'est la question de la dette, par exemple. Aujourd'hui, la dette africaine au profit de la Chine est devenue une dette que certains considèrent comme étant une sorte de piège pour les États qui ont emprunté beaucoup d'argent. À ce niveau, on a noté que les pays africains ont signé 274 prêts d'une valeur de 46,6 milliards de dollars pour les infrastructures de transport. 174 prêts pour des projets énergétiques d'une valeur de 38 milliards de dollars et 141 prêts à des fins de communication et de sécurité. À ce niveau aussi, au-delà de ce que certains considèrent comme étant le debt trap, le piège de la dette, il faut noter que dans ces secteurs-là, il y a des secteurs qui sont stratégiques, comme la sécurité nationale ou la communication. Et à ce niveau, on se rend compte que pour la plupart de ces secteurs-là, ce sont des entreprises chinoises qui gèrent cet aspect pour les gouvernements africains. Donc, à ce niveau, la question de la souveraineté numérique se pose parce qu'on ne gère pas nos données. Ce sont beaucoup plus les entreprises chinoises comme Huawei qui gèrent un peu les données de nos États. L'autre point aussi sur la question de la dette, c'est le fait que je considère qu'on parle beaucoup de la dette, mais il y a aussi lieu de relativiser cette dette-là parce que cette dette concerne pour la plupart une dizaine de pays qui sont les plus endettés face à la Chine. C'est l'Angola avec 25 milliards de dollars, l'Éthiopie, 13,5 milliards de dollars, le Kenya, donc la République du Congo, la Zambie, le Soudan, le Cameroun, le Nigeria, le Ghana et la République démocratique du Congo. Donc, ce sont ces pays qui doivent donc de l'argent à la Chine. À ce niveau, je voudrais qu'on relativise. Parce que la dette africaine, si on prend la dette africaine globalement, la Chine détient 21% de cette dette-là. Et 80% de cette dette-là est entre les mains de certains clubs, comme le Club de Paris ou d'autres institutions. Par conséquent, je pense que le débat sur la dette est un débat qui est fantasmé et qu'il faudrait un peu relativiser. Je voudrais parler des échanges commerciaux, qui est très important, parce qu'on parle de souveraineté, on parle de colonialisme ou de néocolonialisme à ce niveau. Au niveau des échanges commerciaux, si on regarde le schéma des échanges commerciaux entre la Chine et le continent africain, on se rend compte qu'on a gardé l'ancien schéma, c'est-à-dire les échanges que nous avions avec l'Europe ou l'Amérique, ce sont les mêmes échanges que nous avons avec la Chine. On voit que la Chine ici importe du pétrole brut, des hydrocarbures, des minéraux, des pierres précieuses et des métaux de base. L'Afrique importe des machines, des équipements de transport, d'électronique, de textiles, de chaussures. À partir de ce moment donc, on se rend compte que l'Afrique ne travaille pas à changer en fait ce schéma-là et que l'Afrique demeure donc dans ce cycle de dépendance envers l'étranger. Aujourd'hui, hier c'était les États-Unis d'Amérique ou la France, la Grande-Bretagne, aujourd'hui c'est la Chine. À partir de ce moment, pour finir, la question qu'il faudrait se poser, c'est peut-on parler de colonisation dans nos relations avec la Chine? La réponse à mon niveau est d'emblée négative, car les formes violentes qu'a prises la colonisation ne peuvent pas être comparées à la volonté chinoise d'implantation sur le continent dans leur nouvelle politique hégémonique. Vu sous l'angle d'une colonisation européocentrée, la présence chinoise ne peut pas être qualifiée de colonisation. car la colonisation s'est exprimée sous plusieurs formes. Elle a été économique, culturelle, politique, institutionnelle, avec le modèle étatique que nous avons hérité de la colonisation. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons encore le débat sur la décolonisation. Les pays africains ont-ils été totalement décolonisés ou c'est juste un changement de souveraineté, c'est-à-dire une substitution d'un pouvoir politique à un autre pouvoir. Donc, si on analyse bien globalement, nos relations avec les colonisateurs continuent de nous enserrer dans des logiques de dépendance que nous ne parvenons pas à nous libérer. Toutes sortes de liens économiques ont survécu. Si on regarde les pays africains dans la globalité, les banques sont des banques étrangères, les entreprises sont des entreprises étrangères. Donc, nous sommes véritablement dans un prolongement de la colonisation sous d'autres formes. La question aujourd'hui qu'il y a à se poser, c'est de paraphraser à mon niveau Joseph Kizerbo qui disait « À quand l'Afrique ?» À quand l'Afrique traduit une vision prospective pour dessiner la marche de l'Afrique dans ce monde que se disputent les puissances. Aussi longtemps que les Africains ne décideront pas de leur voie à suivre, ils auront le destin d'une feuille morte, car il n'est pas de vent favorable pour celui qui ne sait pas où aller. Voilà, merci beaucoup, merci de votre invitation et je m'en arrête là et je suis ouvert aux questions. Voilà, merci.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim, for such a great presentation, and thank you, Brother Mukeli, for doing the translation. Thus far, it seems as though there's a level of, there's some similarities with Dr. Tara and Dr. Ibrahim's paper, and in terms of whether China is a colonizer or just a business partner to Africa. And we look forward to an engaging discussion. In the interest of time, we're going to just go ahead and also have the other speakers introduced by Blessing, and then we'll continue and have our discussion. Blessing, the mic is to you.
All right, thank you. The next speaker is Zijin, also known by the Yoruba name Titilayo. She received a master's degree in African literature and cultures at Peking University, China. She completed her bachelor's degree in Chinese literature at Beijing Normal University before shifting into African literary and cultural studies. She is currently a graduate student at the Department of African Cultural Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States. Her research interests include African literature, African popular culture, literary and cultural interactions between China and African nations. Should I read the fourth speaker?
We could just hear from Sister Titilayo before our next guest speaker. Thank you. Thank you so much for reading, Sister Blessing.
Thank you. So can you hear me? And
yes,
I also want to share my screen. I can't share my screen now. Sorry.
I need one of the technicians to help you.
Okay.
Augustine, can you help Titilayo to do this?
Oh, I can now.
She has been made a co-host.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you, thank you, Blessing, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar today. I'm very honored and I'm very glad to share some of my thoughts on this ongoing debate on African-China relations. So as a student getting most of my academic training in China, I want to start my talk with some personal experience first. In 2018, I got my BA in Chinese literature at Peking Normal University. And Peking Normal University, for those maybe unfamiliar with China's university institutions, is one of the best institutions in China offering courses on literary studies and pedagogy. And as an undergraduate student at the Department of Chinese Language and Literature, I was required to take compulsory courses named Foreign Literature or World Literature for at least 3 semesters. But I feel sorry to say I was never introduced to an African author in such a class. So, and another important thing is many undergraduate students from our department, if they don't plan to pursue a higher education, like a master or PhD degree after their graduation, will choose to be a high school or junior high school teacher, teaching literature courses across the country and cultivating Chinese younger generations' literary tastes and their knowledge about world literature. But since we never discussed an African literary works in our university class, I really doubt if there's any African author in their imagination in this educator's construction of world literature. And another important experience I'd like to share with you is that when I was in my primary school, translations of European and American literary classics like Robinson Crusoe, The Old Man and the Sea, Gulliver's Travels were must reads for every Chinese primary school pupil, but there were very limited literary works from like Southeast Asia or Latin America and none from Africa. So I think here is a problem. There are increasing interactions between China and African nations, but how do knowledge about African culture and society circulate in China? How will Chinese people shape their imaginations about Africa if they never read any words from an African author? That's why I did my research titled A Historical Survey of Nigerian Literature in mainland China since the late 1950s. I noticed that we teach few African literature in school classes, but we do have a certain number of translations of African literature buried in university libraries. And also considering the number of scholars interested in African literature is growing fast in past several years, I was wondering what was driving the translation and research of African literature in China in the past 60 years. And also interested to know what topics or concerns emerged in China's African literary studies recently. And I chose Nigerian literature as a window into China's African literary studies because, according to my observation, a remarkable number of African literary works in China are from Nigeria. And it is partly because of China's social and cultural history. I will come back and explain this a little bit later. So I take 1958 as an important starting point of China's translation activity to African literature because the Afro-Asian Writers' Conferences first raised Chinese intellectuals' attention to African literary production. And the Writers' Conferences were a series of gatherings of literary figures from Asia and Africa aimed at denouncing imperialism and establishing cultural contacts among Asia and African countries. And the first conference was held in 1958 in Tashkent. And this book, I found it in our university library. Long Live Spirits of Tashkent is a memoir written by the authors in the Chinese cultural delegation after they concluded their visits to Tashkent. Chinese intellectuals explain Tashkent spirit as the spirit of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialization in their memoir essays. The Tashkent conference was so act-making that after this conference, one of the most influential literary journals in China, Translations, changed its name to World Literature in January 1959 and began to translate so-called Asian, African, and Latin American literature for Chinese readers. This journal also followed important literary activities in Africa. For instance, I found that World Literature once published a newsletter about Black Orpheus, the groundbreaking literary journal based in Nigeria, starting point publication in 1958. And also the preface of the first issue of World Literature explained why they paid attention to literary works from Africa. It says, Chinese readers are eager to know literary works from the oppressed people so as to educate themselves. So you see, in the 60s, social realism was the dominant literary strategy adopted by Chinese authors, and Chinese literary critics highlighted an empathy with the oppressed people in Asia, African, and Latin American countries in their literary criticism. And Chinese authors also identified modern Chinese literature as a part of third world literature, with those literary works from Asian, African, and Latin American countries. Just after President Mao proposed third world theory in 1974. And we can also find many Chinese propaganda posters designed for third world solidarity and so-called third world friendship in this period. So I can say third worldism became a common historical memory shared by many Chinese people from different social status in the 60s and the 70s. The attention paid to third world literature in China imagined a political literary landscape shared by oppressed people from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but problematically ignored in the differences and subtleness of historical trajectories among third world nations. Although Chinese readers got in touch with African literature like Things Fall Apart in the 1960s, in-depth study did not spring up until the 1990s. And after that, during the 1967 to 1977, the import of African literature stagnated in mainland China because of the Cultural Revolution. In this decade, nearly all foreign literary translations stopped, but it was until the 1980s, with the reforms and opening art policy, a growing number of translations of African literature released. For example, Foreign Literature Publishing House, which was China's first and largest professional publishing institution specializing in literature, translated and published African literature series in the 1980s. However, after the 1980s, for 3 decades, availability of African literature in Chinese was still limited in 3 ways. First, in terms of the numbers of books translated into Chinese, works by Western writers vastly outnumbered those from Africa. And second, even those field works of fiction by African writers that appeared in Chinese were arguably selected according to prevailing so-called Western tastes. So if to mention 3 best-known Nigerian writers in China during this period, the answer was Wala Shoyinka, Chinua Achebe, and Van Okri. Their works were translated mainly because they won an international prize in the Western world, and their works were mainly analyzed by Chinese critics in a theoretical paradigm originated from Western epistemology, with less attention to their local context in Nigerian social and cultural history. Apart from this, there was always a noticeable shortage of translations from African local languages. So there's a Professor Jiang Hui, a Chinese scholar studying African literature, once explains in his article why the translation of African literary works was much less significant during this period. He said, in the age of revolution, we were willing to get knowledge of Africa, while in the age of enlightenment or development, we just went separate ways. And I also want to emphasize another interesting linkage, which can show a hint of how Western literary production and criteria hugely influenced Chinese scholars' reception of African literature. In the 1980s, an anxiety of going global was hanging over Chinese literary production, and Chinese academia felt great anxiety of development and modernization, and expressed a tendency to consider less scientifically advanced societies as culturally backward. It was an era of looking west. And in the 1986, in the, just the very year when Soyinka became the Nobel Literary Prize winner, the question of when will Chinese writers win the Nobel Prize for Literature was seriously raised at the International Symposium on Contemporary Chinese Literature. And the rising number of Soyinka studies after 1986 was notably combined with Chinese literary scholars' anxiety of going global. In an analysis of Soyinka's literary works, the author Yuan Hua argues Chinese contemporary authors will find useful inspiration from Soyinka's works. It is a direction of all national literatures in the world that we should base on our national tradition and at the same time keep broad and open cultural perspectives. So for this period, I will conclude that the attention paid to Nigerian literature, to African literature since the 1980s was not out of Chinese scholars' interest in African literature per se. When Chinese scholars fixed their whole attention to identify modernization in Chinese literature, Africa, largely regarded as an undeveloped continent, could hardly intrigue most intellectuals' interest of this period. But in the past decade, things are changing. The translation and study of Nigerian literature has undergone a resurgence. Classic writers' literary works were published, and the fictions of some new generation writers were also translated. Meanwhile, I think a good sign is Chinese scholars start self-reflection in literary studies after nearly 100 years eagerness of emulating the West. Many important questions have been raised from African literary studies. Some scholars explored the possibility of conducting a comparative analysis of modern African literature and modern Chinese literature. And many scholars realized the importance of studying and translating African language literatures. Most importantly, a growing number of Chinese scholars turned their eyes back to the history of Third World and attempt to reevaluate the kind of tradition or legacy from the era of anti-imperialism and anti-colonization. These endeavors are no longer confined by those dogmatic political slogans or ideological indoctrination stated 60 years ago. And in the past 60 years, I think Sino-African literary interaction didn't stay on track with the plan established in the Tashkent Conference. The literary connections between African writers and Chinese writers still seem scarce. By examining generational differences of translation and study of African literature in China, I hope to complicate our understanding of Sino-African interactions. The literary history reveals Chinese scholars' struggle of breaking with Eurocentric epistemology in literary studies and the endeavor to reimagine a more inclusive world literature landscape. Recent years have witnessed closer cooperation between China and African nations, which might increase possibilities for China and Africa to represent each other in their cultural protection, in which a new power imbalance may emerge. And this time, the imbalance is inside the Third World. I think answers to our webinar's question are still taking shape. And I hope there will be more and more authors, artists, cultural producers working on Sino-African encounters, engaging this topic and offering their answers. I'll stop here. Thank you all for your listening and thank you for your patience. You're muted.
Pardon me. Thank you, Chief, for such a great presentation. We look forward to having a great discussion. Now we're going to have our last speaker, not the least. Sister Blessing, could you please introduce our speaker?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Adebola Ola, also known as Bola for short. He's a scholar, artist, and entrepreneur. His research interests include Afro-Asian musical exchange with a focus on East Africa, West Asia, and China. His recent research examines African-China musical and cultural exchange before the 1500 AD and the role Arabs and Persians played in facilitating this interchange. This research provides a fresh perspective to Africa-China narrative, which is usually dominated by trade relations, and provides a historical reference point which may serve as a foundation for a stronger cultural relations between Africa and China in the 21st century. Bola is currently a PhD candidate in musicology at the College of Fine Arts, Boston University, Massachusetts, United States. He was a former Andrew W. Mellon Scholar at the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees. He holds a licentiate diploma from the Trinity College London and a certificate in copyright law from the Harvard Law School. He is a member of the International Council of Traditional Music and a member of the Golden Key International Honors Society. Bola is also a recipient of the Paddy King Robinson Prize for Music Theory, awarded by the prestigious Associated Board of the Royal Schools of Music, London.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Bola. The floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. So first and foremost, I have to, tell you why I have the mask on. It's just because we had a very recent case here, and just last night, and just for the case, just to be safe, I would be in, have the mask on for now. And I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, we can.
All right, good. So first and foremost, thank you to African Research Network for giving me this opportunity to present my research and ideas as it concerns Africa-China relations. And also thank you to my fellow panelists for presenting interesting ideas about this topic. I really look forward to an interesting question and answer sections afterwards. Now, the first thing is this: what would a decolonized discourse on Africa-China relations look like? A discourse that is not mediated through the lens of Euro-America, or a discourse that does not rely on Euro-logic, as George E. Lewis says. Can China be simply understood by its current actions, or should China be understood in a larger framework, one which examines China's role in the world historically and today? This presentation aims to present a decolonized view of Africa-China relations mediated through Western lenses and focusing on Africa's relations with China on their own terms. All right. Now, I'm not certain what Africa-China relations is at the moment, if it's business or colonialism or both. And I'm very careful to make any conclusion in a case. And the reason I'm being careful is because a lot of the information that I've read on China-Africa relations is not derived from an African source. I mean, that's from my own point of view as an African, or from research that is rooted in the dynamic relationship between Africa and China. In fact, most books that I've read and would consider objective have come to the conclusion that Africa's relations with China has been overall good. It is by no means perfect, but compared to Africa's relations with other regional hegemons and superpowers, historically and presently, China has by far presented Africa with a fair deal. This leads me to the core aspect of my presentation. In this talk, I will present to you 4 periods of Africa-China relations dating back to the 8th and 9th century. But before I delve into that details, I would like to share with you how I got into this research and to basically tell you why I think it is important, the way or the reason we get into such research, as it is a very politicized area. My interest in Africa-China stems from the cultural similarities shared between many African cultures and China, and I'm speaking as a musicologist. So, for example, in my research, or even before I got into researching, I realized that we shared a lot of things in common. For example, when it comes to helping, each other, for example, when a person becomes successful in Africa, they are more or less morally obliged, to help others up. And it was something that, I realized it was not, it was we shared in common. Also, when it comes to personal connections, it is quite what we call, what some people call nepotism, but we call it personal connections in terms of helping each other or getting, or rather in contrast with the state machinery that we'll find in many Euro-American systems, the use of personal connections in securing certain things, including jobs, was very prominent among many African and Chinese people. Now, the ones that become very interesting to me is the issue of, honoring ancestors and, the festivals and, the tie between people who are currently living and their ancestors. I found that to be very, very, interesting. But for me in particular, as a musicologist, one thing that struck me and interested in Africa-China relations, or that propelled me to think about what was going on in that between those regions, is the music. So, of particular interest to me is the soundscape of both worlds and the use of pentatonic scales. So pentatonic scales is a 5-scale system, and it's not used only in Africa and China, but there's a particular way in which it is used in Yoruba music and Chinese music, which made me curious to find out if this is a case of diffusion, or if there's any migration going on, or if it's a totally independent and parallel phenomenon in terms of how it develops. This is where my Africa-China research began, and it nurtured and had nurtured it for a while before I had the opportunity to pursue this line of research. This approach, which is based on my interest in Africa-China cultural exchange and by extension trade relations, enabled me to retain more or less an open mind, and I would say a neutral ground to examine what is happening between those two regions. My proposal to you today is that before we can conclude on China's role in Africa, we need to understand China. And to understand China, we need to understand China's role in the world historically, with Africa especially. My submission is that a brief overview of this relation should be able and should equip us, and we must and may be able to understand what is going on in the larger spectrum of events historically and in the present. Now, Africa-China relations can be categorized into 4 eras. The first era, which is before the 15th century, was when Arabs and Persians served as intermediaries between Africa and China. They informed the Chinese about Africa before the Chinese officially visited Africa. In the second era was during the 15th century, when the Chinese visited Africa officially and had the first-hand experience of Africa. The third era of Africa-China relations is somewhere early 18th to 19th century, thereabouts, and was facilitated by Europeans and later Americans. This came with some certain types of relationship between Africa and China, which I will explain in detail a bit later. The final era, beginning around 1955, but we could say 20th century, marks the era when Chinese directly engaged Africa again and on their own terms. So the first two eras were pre-European colonialism or colonial times, and the last two eras were after the colonial times. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because we see different changes in the relationship between Africa and China during this period. Now, in the first era, all the information that China knew about Africa, most of the information were derived from Arab and Persian travelers who traded extensively with China. And we do not know of any official relationship established before the 15th century. We do know that the first mention or knowledge of Africa that is documented is in the Tang Dynasty, which is between 1680, the Tang Dynasty is, 1618 to 1906, roughly. And that is the first time that we hear of Africa mentioned in Chinese sources. And particularly during this period, I looked at the description of, Africa and what they thought about Africa and how they related with their description and understanding of Africa. Now, this period was a little bit, we see that the understanding of Africa was mostly based on what we do know now. It's based on what the Arabs and Persians had told them, or the information that they had shared with them, and was based on the parts of Africa that the Arabs and Persians were very familiar with. During this era, they were the descriptions, which I wouldn't put here, was, could have some tendency to be racist. I would put it that way. But we do know, for example, in the second era, which China had a direct China relates directly with Africa during the voyages of Jianghu in the Ming Dynasty. We do know that tendency immediately changes. We see that the descriptions are quite different, and we see, we look at it in terms of the tone used and the way they related with Africa. Now, during this period, I'll quickly go through the second, what I call the second era. The Chinese, sought to go out and establish relationships with other nations, and Africa was part of those nations. We know, for example, in the 5th century, they visited parts of the east coast of Africa, and we do know that some African emissaries went to China and were brought back in the 6th century, which they also visited parts of Africa. Now, again, the description that we see and the relationship between China and Africa during this period, I believe, was quite cordial and ended not in terms of the trade, but in terms of the official political relationship, ended quite on a cordial note, which is, can be, you can relate it to the whole, the giraffe that was sent, to China, to Peking at the time. And I mean, there's a whole lot of what it represents to them, but whichever way you like to put it, it ended that era and that relationship in a very cordial manner. Now, the third era, which is in the 18th to 19th century, is a very different era again, one that is mediated not through a direct relationship between Africa and China, but through Europe and later America. At this point, we find that like we had pre the 15th century, that China was also not, neither China nor Africa at this point was operating independently. By this time, we had the colonialism was in European colonialism was already well established. And at that time, we know that China had problems with England during the Opium War and had parts of China occupied, etc., which I believe is an issue that we all know. But what I want to stress from this era is that the relationship between China and Africa resembles that which we had pre the 15th century. And now when we go back to the fourth era, which again, China establishes its relationship with Africa directly, we see a resemblance with the 15th century, exhibition and relationship with China, with Africa rather. And this relationship, I believe, can be traced back to somewhere around 1955 during the Bandung Conference. And then we see further strengthening during the FOCAC conference in 2006. And from then on, already during the 50s and 60s, we see a lot of strengthening of Africa-China relations through all sorts of projects which China initiates with Africa. Now, I want to quickly point your attention to a few things, because in order for us to understand or to project or to predict what China might do, or if China is just trading with us as for trade, or is it business, or is it colonialism, we have to look at how China has behaved historically. And that's why I quickly run through China's relations with Africa. And you would realize that I've tried not to use a Western lens to analyze China's relations with Africa. Now, what I realized from my research is that the behavior of China with Africa when it related with Africa directly was very different. And on this case, we have two periods, during the 15th century and in the 20th century. And in the period where China did not relate with Africa directly, first of all, before the 15th century, when their relationship was mediated by the Arabs and Persians, and also later on in the 18th, 19th century, mediated by Europe and later America, we see that the relationship is different. Now, what I'm trying to establish by pointing you to this historical narrative and connection and relations between Africa and China is that I think China's decisions are based on certain principles, Confucian principles being one of them, and China has not demonstrated historically that, and it has had a civilization and documented civilization for over, at least to be conservative, 2,000 years. So in those many years, we have not seen China behave in a certain way. So, and that's why I took you through that historical layout of their relationship. So I'm then inclined to not think of China in that way, that we frame China to be as a colonialist. But I would also like to, as I begin to conclude my thoughts and my presentation, I would like to point us to the role that Africa plays in all of this. And I want to quote a professor, Kwesi Kwa-Pra, who is a Ghanaian and works in China. He says, the challenge is not for us to mourn about Chinese racism and lack of altruism in their dealings with Africans on the trade and economy front. either on the continent or in China. It is for us all. It is for us to know that all nations, particularly the big ones, act in their own self-enlightened interest. There are no moral rules in this. The rules are all guided by selfishness. That is the principle, and all players play according to understanding about this. We tend to act as if we expect other people to be nice to us, even though we know that for hundreds of years, other societies have used other people and have exploited them. They are not, nobody is going to change. Of course, nobody is going to change. This is how all societies behave to each other. The political slogans that have been bandied around are as hollow as the wind. It is for us to learn to act in our own self-interest. And to do this properly, we must work together as a unit so that we do not, as a puny statelets, allow ourselves to be bought off one by one. Now, there is, I would like to, preempt some of the questions as I conclude my thoughts, which is always the question centered around Africa taking over, the states and territories in Africa. And my response to that, as I conclude my thoughts, is that I'm very sure that that is in the negotiation and in the contract as agreed by any creditor or lender and the person that or the country that they are dealing with. And I'm also very sure that these things are in the contract and are well negotiated thoroughly. So it should not come as a surprise when, for example, an airport or a territory is taken over by any foreign power, because I assume that it is the way lenders and creditors behave. And we know that locally, when it comes to banks and other lenders, and I do not think any of it should be different. I think this is where we need to look at, and it is that we should hold certain governments, and in this case, I would say that African governments must decide if they are able to, they should know what their ability or what they can borrow, and they should be responsible about their borrowing and about how they use the funds and if they're able to borrow. In other words, if they cannot borrow, if they cannot pay back the loan, that they should not take it, and if they do take it, that they should pay back to avoid these types of questions. So in conclusion, is China doing simply business or colonial? I would say that basically we are returning to an old order, an old world order where China would also exert and play its own role. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ola, for such an insightful presentation. Now we're going to go to the discussion set part of our gathering today. I'll just give a quick recap to all the 4 presentations to those probably who have come late. So our first presenter, Dr. Tara, gave us a great presentation on, in general, she gave us the presentation. She highlights the fact that the business part of it, the cultural part of it, and she also discussed she defined what colonialism is, which is what other papers have not done. So it's good that we got that. She defined what colonialism is, and she concluded that China, from her perspective, is not. She wouldn't use the term colonialism, but it's some sort of ism. And she provided us with several examples, and those of you that are already here, I'm sure you've already taken notes. so we can have more discussions on that. And Dr. Ibrahim talked about the cultural exchange as also opportunities for Africa with China. He also talked about debt. You know, we usually talk of China giving loans to African countries, and then in some use the term colonizing us with this debt, because we're getting all this debt and we can't pay them back. And he's saying that, well, even Africa is still owing other countries in the Western world. And he's saying also that Africa is dealing with its former colonizers. So why are we putting so much pressure on China? From his perspective, China is doing business with Africa, and it's Africa's responsibility to do business with China the way they want to do it. Dr. Ibrahim, you're here, so you can correct me based on, you know, with my summary. And we have her area is literature. And she's saying that, you know, for a very long time, she's been attended school in China, the top universities in China. Mind you, I've been to those universities. I visited them on Capital Normal, and also Shandong, and also I forgot the name. Pardon me. So she's attended the top schools, and one of them is actually considered like the Harvard of China. Okay. And or the Oxford, you know, in the UK of China. And even as a student there, she didn't get she didn't read much on Africa, and she was influenced. The Chinese view on Africa was influenced, or is influenced, by the Western literature. And then we have Mr. Ola, who you just heard, and he also focused on on the cultural part of Africa-China relations. And now I'm going to open the floor for the questions, so that we can draw more from our speakers, who, mind you, they've been here, by the way, they're here without us paying them. So we're grateful for you taking your time to do this, to prepare this presentation and share your knowledge with us, so that we can have better understanding of Africa-China relations. Thank you. And we have a hand up, and Brother Shabazz.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. They're all fantastic. I think I'm sympathetic to Sister Dr. Tara's point that the China-African relations are something in between that is still sort of playing out, not really colonial, but we should watch it and see, you know, make sure, as some of the other presenters have noted, that our interests are somehow protected. But my question is, I guess maybe the elephant in the room for all of our speakers, and especially the professor from China, Professor Xi, if I'm saying it correctly, the elephant in the room for me are the images, right, of Africans being maltreated in China. And so how do we reconcile, or what are your thoughts on those images? Are they reflective, if any of you have been in China, besides alongside of our professor who grew up in China? What are your thoughts on those images and what they mean? Are they reflective of how Chinese people see Africa generally, or not? And then secondly, it was kind of hinted at with Professor Bola's talk, I think, about, he says that Africans must act together in their response to China. The problem is that currently Africa is not together, right? And so China has they're relating to China on an unequal basis. China has a powerful economy, and Africans are making deals, but they're representing weak economies. The only solution to that, seems to me, is a Pan-African orientation, where Africans take the political step of uniting and then forming a bloc that can negotiate on equal terms with China. Thank you.
Thank you for such a great question. The floor is open to to our speakers. Any of you could please respond to it.
Certainly. Unfortunately, my connection, I lost a connection at the very end of the speaker's question, so forgive me if I don't address it in full. But you pose an interesting question regarding the images of African people and their treatment, particularly in China. And this is actually an area that I work in specifically, looking at images and messages of the relationship and how they are used, how they're employed, particularly by the Chinese state, as a way of inculcating a particular image of self amongst the majority of people across the continent. And so when there are images and messages that disrupt state-driven and state-led messages, then it becomes problematic. And we've seen recent images such as those that have been transmitted out of China in relation to COVID-19, in particular, in attribution of the causes of that to ethnic African migrants who are in China. And it leads one to question this idea of cultural sameness, which underpins much of the soft power messaging that originates in the Chinese state. But again, one of the things that I pointed to is that I think we have to caution ourselves, and not that it really matters in the end, because if people are being mistreated and people are being maligned, and we know that it's happening in part because of the way that they look and where they originate from, that's problematic, just on the face of it. But there are also things that happen from a Chinese cultural perspective. And I say that with the understanding that there are many Chinas within this one bounded geography. But if we think about it from a sort of a broadly speaking Chinese cultural perspective, there's the sense of cultural universalism or particularism that impacts the way that people on the ground view the other. And there are, as our speaker, she mentioned, there's a greater deal of familiarity with the Europeans. There's a certain way in which Euro-American people, Western people have been constructed within China. And that also impacts the view of African people in China. But beyond that, there's also a view of how Chinese people see themselves vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And we can think of it in terms of, again, China viewing oneself as being the center, which is a space that it has operated within for the vast majority of recorded history. It's only been in the last 150 years or so that we don't really think of China as being sort of the center of the world. And so we have all of these different things that are feeding into the ways in which this sense of self amongst local Chinese, but also views of the other and racial alterity and how they develop. So those images are about more than simply sort of the ways in which African people are being viewed or being treated. It has a lot to do with this Chinese cultural view of self, but also a view of self through the lens of sort of Euro-American racial alterity as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Tara. Anyone else from the panel on image, Africa's image in China? Maybe we can even, I can put this question to Mr. Olaf, because you look at culture, yeah, you look at African culture and Chinese culture, and you highlight that very much and said that there's lots of similarities. And I keep wondering, I mean, with this, we could say the same thing with let's say other ethnic groups where there's similarities, but does that mean that we should you know, but still there's this power dynamic that goes on between Africa and China. But you're saying that culture, you know, we have a lot, we share a lot, therefore we should not see China as a threat. Correct me if I'm wrong, please.
Yeah, okay. No, I didn't say that at all. what I said was that that was what interested me in finding out what do they have in common. There were those things that I read about, that I saw, and this was not even related to trade or colonialism, and I was talking about earlier on. So that's what led me to want to know more about Africa, China, and I was even more specific about the music, which is my area of specialization. About the sounds, the melodies, because in our area, when you're examining interconnectedness and music and migration, what comes to your mind is you hear similarities. You hear music from different places, maybe skill systems or modes and all of that. And
Hello?
hello?
Yeah, can you hear us?
Okay, yeah, no, it went off for a minute. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's how we look at music and migration and people. We hear certain sounds, certain kind of skill systems, and we wonder is it because of migration or an interaction, or is it just a parallel phenomenon? And so that was what I said regarding the cultural similarities. Not to say that because there are cultural similarities, and so we should assume that everything is overlapping. I hope I've clarified that point.
Yes, thank you so much. And we have a question from Mr. Joseph. Please go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know that China as a state tries to project a certain image, and they do so using some of the Confucius institution in different parts of Africa, and in fact, in different parts of the world. But what really bothers me is that the lived experience of individuals from Africa does not really align with those, with what the country is projecting. For instance, I have friends who have worked with Chinese, and the story has not been good. I have friends who have worked in Chinese companies like Huawei.
Attention, please. The signal tone you have just heard indicated a report of an emergency in this building. If your floor is that.
Okay. So it is one thing for a country or a state to project certain images. It's another thing for people outside of that country to experience what they are projecting. And I must say, to a great extent, going by some of the images that we've seen, which Dr. Shabazz mentioned earlier on, you find there are restaurants in Africa owned by Chinese, and those restaurants deny Africans access into them. Like the officials, like people working in those restaurants will deny Africans access. They would say Africans are not allowed. So I don't know how you want to reconcile that with the image that China is projecting as a state.
Yeah, great question. Great question. I'll put that to our speakers, if they can please respond to it.
Okay. So I just would like to answer concerning the two questions. First is the question for images. So if for someone who are working on Africa-China relation, if you take the meaning of Africa in Henyu, like in Mandarin, Africa means Feiqiu. So this is the beginning of the Chinese representation of Africa. Feiqiu means the mystery, the continent where there is nothing. It becomes a way that Chinese represent themselves, the African continent, before going there. If you take the meaning of US, for example, US means in China, in Chinese language, the beautiful country. the beautiful country. It is the meaning of US. Before you go in US, if you heard the name of US, you say that, so I have to go there. It should be a very nice country. It's a way that the construction of image began in the Chinese mentality. But the question is how the Chinese government do to tackle such kind of negative construction concerning Africa. They have to work on media and to show what is really Africa, what are Africa. But if you look at the media, most of the image that you see concern most of the time the Africans problem, like the disease, war, and so and so. And sometimes if you see some image in concerning Africa, they show you the safari, the animals, and sometimes people in China ask you whether you live with the animals, because it's the representation that they have with Africa. So this is a point which should be taken by both, because we have to ask also what the African government do to present a positive image to Africa or for Africa in China. What they do, they did not put this point on the debate, on their agenda, because they're the kind of relationship that they build is like a begging relationship. You know, this is the problem with the leader. Even where there is the problem in Guangzhou with people who are supposed to come with the COVID-19 in China without control it. At that time, you see there is an official African government who condemn this situation. In Senegal, we see the Chinese ambassador who write a paper on our official journal to explain what is happening there, just to show you that they defend themselves, they defend their country. But the problem is what Africans do on this. This is the problem that we have at this point. Okay, yeah. So I want my colleagues to give the input concerning this point.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahim. That's a great recommendation for African countries. And but I'm wondering though, how do you reconcile? Because you can say that African countries could do better in terms of presenting Africa, right? But then how do you reconcile that even within the language, within Chinese language, Africa is that place of nothingness. So there's probably something inherently, problematic, or, about this nation that thinks of Africa as this place of nothingness. And as you know, historically, Europeans have this view of Africa as well. As a result, they justified colonization of the continent, of African people. So don't you see that there's somewhat, because you seem to be a bit more relaxed or more, less harsh to Chinese behavior or China's behavior on the continent? Yeah, that's just a response, unless if you want to say something about it, but we could move on to other questions. Okay.
I would like to say something just, quickly. So the thing is, definitely Africa-China relations is not perfect. It has its problems here and there. And there's a popular consensus that people-to-people relations is nowhere near government-to-government relations, and that is well, researched and documented. But what I would like to say, is that Africa did not, China did not always have that. Africa did not always mean that. What Professor Ibrahim said, it means that has not always been the understanding of the Chinese. And what I was trying in my presentation, I tried to show the changing relationship, or how Africa-China relations and the way they see each other, especially from Chinese view, because that's where we have a lot more information and data, has always changed depending on how the relationship, has been, whether it's mediated through an intermediary, or if it has been direct, as we see in the 15th century and now. And I would like to say, even though, and I'm, open to further questions, that this is a carryover from the 18th, 19th century, which is and I'm not defending China. I don't have any, reason to do that, but this is my own observation, that it is a carryover of what happened in the 18th, 19th, even maybe early 20th century. I think, for example, that if you look at the documents of the 15th century when the Chinese were in Africa, they did not see Africa that way. So the question is, what's changed? So, and if they have always related with and seen Africa in the same way over the years, then it will be understandable. But then if it changes with time, over time, we need to ask, what's changed? What is the variable? What makes it change? So in my opinion, I would say that that is the carryover from what I call the third era. But to directly answer Dr. Kunuji's question, would be that I don't think we can put on the Chinese government. I don't think we can put that responsibility on the Chinese government, what people-to-people relationship turns out to be. I think that would be a little bit. I think again that we are concerned because of our immediate passage, which is the colonialism from the West, from Europe, and whatever. And so we are a little bit too quick. If something happens, we don't look at the dynamics very well. And it could as well be that that is what is happening. I don't doubt that. But what I'm trying to say is that we should, in my own opinion, if we want to make a conclusion or judgment on China as a nation, as a country, then we cannot say what the individual, because in every society, there are all sorts of people. There are good people, bad people, and so on and so forth. And so people could behave in that way. But if we look at what the Chinese government is talking about, then we should maybe make that judgment as a government-to-government relation. That's what I feel. And not take what is happening at the individual to represent what is happening at the government-to-government. But it could also be that, what is happening at the individual to individual level is a reflection of what is happening up, only that it has been, dressed, if I could put it that way, to look good. But I think we are yet to know what exactly the situation is.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Ola. And Khadija has her hand up, but before I call on Khadija, I would like to hear from Chi's perspective. In fact, someone mentioned that in the chat on how Africans are being treated in China. What are your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, actually, I can take all this criticism about Chinese, all kinds of stereotypical images on Africa. I know that, and I also see many kinds of very sad words and on social media. And I think to change this situation, China has a long way to go. Just as I mentioned in my PowerPoint, we need to change our what we teach, what kind of knowledge about African culture, African society, and African people should be taught in Chinese at all kinds of educational institutions. Just to mention, I think every Chinese will, with a primary education, will know Shakespeare, but I think few of them just know the like Wala Shoinka or Chinua Achebe, such big figures in African literary field. So I think narrative matters and stories matters. I just want to hear more African stories be presented in African social media, in the Chinese social media, and let more Chinese people, just let more African people to tell their stories, their encounters with Chinese people, no matter it's in Africa continent or in China, and just people's opinions should be challenging, and this is a very long way to go. Yeah, and for me as a student studying African literature, I think what I can do is to translate more African literary works, to translate more articles, essays written by African intellectuals to Chinese readers, what they are talking about, what they are discussing on racism, on those African-China relationships, to more Chinese readers, because most of them, Chinese people, not every Chinese people know English, know French, know those languages about spoken in Africa continent. So language barrier is also a very important thing to consider. Yeah, that's my thoughts on this question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Khadija, you have a question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. To Jane's presentation, literary translations of African works there in China, and you gave a kind of historical survey, but I was asking of how, when we think the other way around, which means the presence of Chinese literature and language here in Africa, and the justifications behind, because many of us here are aware of the recent upsurge in the kind of Chinese government, the Chinese cultural centers donating kind of thousands of books, for example, in the National Book Fair in Kenya. For example, establishing the Black Civilizations Institute in Senegal, building one of the biggest libraries in Tanzania, apart many other kinds of cultural interventions. But in here, if we consider it or compare it to the European kind of Euro-American presence here in Africa, as that, can this be considered as a soft power? Because we always understand that soft power is one of the facets or one of the manifestations of colonialism, and even Euro-American presence in many kind of world regions, not only in Africa, started culturally in a way, and started religiously in a way. That's why in here, I'm asking myself what justifies maybe the recent upsurge, as you have shown in your presentation from 2010, towards all of these translations, and even in terms of scholarships given to thousands of African students every year going to China and studying there. So this drives me to one questioning, I'm not sure whether there is any answer to this or not, is that isn't because of colonial and business purposes, China is kind of way pushing its own kind of people who are not yet ready to accept Africans as a cultural other through these programs and cultural presence and scholarships to students who are Africans and in there. Because if we compare China's openness to the world to the European countries and many other countries, was really kind of less and less in kind of intensity, if we can compare it. So in here you gave a historical survey, but you mentioned the idea that there is a continuous upsurge in translations since 2010. Can this relate to the fact that China is having other purposes here in Africa that are manifesting themselves culturally and educationally first. Thank you.
Thank you, Khadija. And the floor is open to our guest speakers. If you could respond to that, please. Maybe I can call on Dr. Tara. Dr. Tara?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get my mind around her question, which I actually think is a very important question, in that it speaks to the desire to create a sense of familiarity with one's culture, which, as she rightly mentioned, was an important aspect of the colonial project and remains one even within the tenets of neocolonialism. I would say that one of the concerns, and as you referenced on the within China, is the fact that the Chinese state, meaning the government led by the Chinese Communist Party, has very particular goals. All right, and within my for the state as a whole and its positioning as a global power. So their geopolitical goals sometimes don't align or not necessarily have been effectively communicated to people on the ground, which creates a sort of disjointed message. So there's an interest in messages and how there are differences in the way that those messages are created at the state level versus the way in which people interact on a one-to-one level. I think that if we think about sort of these contributions, especially in the realm of literature and language, they go hand in hand actually. Because what's happening is that the state has a very particular vision for how it is going to continue to inculcate a particular image of China in Africa, but also in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. But what we find is that people on the ground who, as our other speaker, she mentioned, may or may not possess any familiarity, one, with the languages of communication in Africa, but also with people in Africa. So the messages and images that they receive are very limited. And those that they do see tend to skew negative, all right? So they perpetuate these sort of Euro-American narratives of the other. All right, so there's some consistency in that respect. And so what the Chinese state is attempting to do is they are focused on this message of sameness, which is reinforced at every level. We hear about it from Xi Jinping when he talks to diplomatic audiences. We hear about it, as someone mentioned, in editorials that are written in local newspapers by Chinese ambassadors to various African nations. But we also see it in the way in which they put money towards certain soft power efforts, like the donations of these books that I'm very interested in because I don't know anything about that, as well as the Black Civilization Institute in Senegal. These are an important part of the soft power campaign, which, as we know, creates an environment. It creates a positive environment for the Chinese. So there's a goal from the state perspective, in that this is an important aspect of diplomacy. But the problem comes in because we have a people who, as some of our earlier speakers have mentioned, for the most part are largely unaware of who African people are, what Africa as a space is, and these histories and cultures that within high level rhetoric on Africa, there's an attempt to create this element of sameness, but people on the ground don't necessarily know that, right? So they're, for the most part, unfamiliar. You see this when someone asked about us traveling to China. I travel to China, or at least I did, with the exception of the last couple of years, very frequently. People take pictures of me as I walk down the street. I'm a celebrity, but this is because people are unfamiliar with brown skin. They're unfamiliar with Blackness. And so despite the fact that there are these high level conversations about sameness, about the same history, the same experiences, the same traditions and culture, on the ground level, most people are unfamiliar. And so the Chinese state has to, or not has to, but they are, they've embarked upon this sort of dual campaign. So as I mentioned briefly within my talk, they're actually attending to the domestic audience, which isn't unusual. We saw this during the Colonial Project. In particular, you have to mobilize the support of domestic audiences for your efforts abroad. And so they're attempting to do that, but there are some problems that go along with that. When we think about things like FOCAC, so the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, they come together every couple of years, they meaning Chinese leaders, as well as the leaders of the vast majority of African states, -1. They come together, they make commitments and statements regarding the relationship, where it's going, and it typically concludes with the Chinese state making financial commitments in the realm of billions of dollars, all right, tens of billions of dollars, we're moving into hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, that's great from sort of a soft power diplomatic relationship, sort of putting your money where your mouth is perspective, but people on the ground don't necessarily understand that because there are needs domestically. And so I think I've moved far afield of the original question, but I say this to say that from the perspective of leadership within the Chinese state, they are actually embarking on a dual sort of campaign. So there's a domestic campaign, but there's also the external international campaign, of which many of these soft power sort of images and messages are an important component of.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Chara, for such a rich response. And as you're speaking, actually, and this actually brings me to all of the presentation as it relates to, it seems like there's a disconnect to some extent between what the governments are doing, African governments that is, with China, and what's happening on ground, because it seems like there's this dissatisfaction with what is happening on ground, but then based on your presentations, generally, there's this common thread of the fact that China is doing business and this is how they're doing it. And it seems to be going okay, but then Africans on the ground are worried that, for example, even Dr. Ibrahim did cite that there's some products that are being produced in Senegal that is cheaper, so it affects the local market, and this is something that's not being addressed. So so that's my general observation on your presentations. Do we have any last questions? Because we've been here for far too long. I know some of you need to. It's early on your part, you have to get going with your day. So do we have another question before we start wrapping things up?
So I just want to add one thing concerning the soft power. Here in Senegal, we have what we call INA. INA is the school of the elite. Even in INA, INA, for the French colonized countries like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and so, they have imported this kind of institution from French, like the elite, where the French elites are training. We have created the same things here. We call it INA. in INA, you have a space dedicated for China, because the Chinese government know that this is where the Senegalese elites are trained. So we have to improve our soft power. We have to look how we can influence those elites to to have more relation with China tomorrow when they become a ministry or an administrative how to say no political decisional politics. I mean, it's like how to say in English, like so I forgot. This is just to explain that in INA we train the elite of our country, and in the library of INA you have a space dedicated for Chinese books, for Xi Jinping's books. So just to influence the elites for tomorrow. This is such kind of plan that in the Chinese soft power they have in Africa. But we are talking about the disconnection between the government and the researcher. I used to say that they don't care about what we are saying, what we are talking. What they are interested is just how to make money, how to negotiate, how to take briefs on the contracts, and for the population, for the researcher, they don't care about them. This is the way that they are ruling. The problem is not for me, China. The problem is the African government and the African elites.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You add another layer to this, that China is even being invited to a sacred space that belongs to the community, and it's very interesting. And also in terms of China donation, the soft power that we keep mentioning. I've recently saw a video, I think it was shared in the group chat, of someone teaching Chinese to African kids, and is teaching them to hate themselves pretty much, inciting self-hatred, instilling self-hatred in them, telling them that they're inferior. And so we also have to look at the package. When somebody gives you a package, you should be careful when you open it, because it could be a bomb. So to some extent, maybe that's not a good comparison, but to some, but the point I'm making is that when somebody gives you a gift, you have to be careful what that gift is going to do to you. So that is that's how I'm thinking in my head about when you said about China, also coming to a space, a sacred space that is for the locals. And it also reminds me, even with the African Union, recently African Union invited an observer that has, from the Middle East, that is now, many have complained about that, because why would you invite somebody to be, a nation that is not necessarily part of an African nation to be part of an African Union? So it's sort of similar to me of what's going on in Senegal. Now we come to the end of our, actually last question, and then we will end this, because if not, we will go on and on, because China-Africa relations conversation is usually hot. So the last question for our guest speakers is, do you see Africans coming together to work towards a way that we can work with China that will benefit us in a Pan-African way? Maybe I'm not asking, I don't know whether you get the question. Could Africa come together? Do you think it's realistic for Africans to come together and work in such a way that that will be beneficial to them as they interact with China?
So I'll respond very briefly. So one of the ways that they certainly can come together is through FOCAC, and relatedly, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative and its place in, on, and through the continent. One of the concerns has been this lack of African agency at the start on the part of leaders with regard to having very clear thoughts regarding what they want in terms of the transactional nature of this relationship. And so one of the ways to actually be more effective in actually securing shared interests would be to come together in some ways, perhaps consider negotiating rather than as individual nations. Think about negotiating through the African Union as an example, coming together to make decisions regarding shared benefits. But I think that ultimately, Professor Ibrahim's point regarding the responsibility being on African leaders is an important one that we don't discuss enough with regard to this particular relationship, because despite all of the negative things that we brought up today and regarding the similarities between earlier systems and the way in which Africa-China relations is playing out, the reality is that African nations find themselves in the enviable position of being courted by multiple suitors, China being merely one of them. And so it's up to the leaders of these nations to listen to their people. As you've mentioned, many people on the ground have very distinct and particular opinions regarding this relationship that are rooted in personal interaction, but it's up to them to listen to their people and make the best decisions for themselves. China isn't the only option, but China remains a good option that could be leveraged against existing options like the UK, France, and the US. Alongside that, it's also important to note that China is a sovereign nation. And so they are, as a country, they're seeking what's in their best interest. So while they do make donations, contributions to various people and spaces across the continent, ultimately, they're doing so because it will benefit them in some way. And so it's up to leaders across the continent, either alone or in some element of sort of Pan-African unity, to come together and figure out how to effectively make decisions that benefit them regardless of how it impacts China.
So,
thank you, Dr. Kara, for that.
In my point of view, what I think is possible is to let the regional organization like SADC, ECOWAS, to negotiate for this for the countries. It's for me the only way to negotiate it together, by negotiating by regional organizations. But with United African Union, it will be very complicated for me. But the other things concerning the debate, the agenda, we have to ask who is leading the agenda. The point that the government have discussing with China. We are there is the coming focus in Senegal, but till now we don't know what will be the agenda. Who has to decide the topic that we have to talk? Which topic is more interesting African countries? So most of the time, the Chinese authorities, decided of the agenda, what we have to discuss and what we have not to discuss. This is the problem that we have in our relationship between us and China.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Mr. Ola, do you have response to that question? Okay.
Sorry, you couldn't hear me. I was muted out. No, I don't. I don't have a response to that question.
Okay. Titilayo, do you have a response to that?
No.
Okay. Yes. Okay. Okay. Thank you all for such insightful papers, and thank you so much for your for your responses, and thank you all for your questions. Let me see if we have any comment or question in the chat before we wrap things up. Okay. All right. We're just saying thank you all for your presentations. And we're really grateful that you took the time, to our guest speakers, that you took the time to prepare your presentations and do this such a great, for giving us such a, a lot to think of. I would like to actually remind you all, especially to our guests, to our members, that we have our webinar is coming up October. Next webinar will be October 9th, 1700 UK time. Is going to be about Blackness, identity politics, and conflict of interest. So we have a professor coming from the UK that will be presenting from the UK, North Carolina, and also South Africa. And now I'm going to call on our president to, to say a brief words of thanks before we wrap it up. Dr. Remy? I hope I did not lose the okay, pardon me. Can you all hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes, I'm not sure where Dr. Remy is. He's our president. I was calling on him if you can say anything.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now, sir.
Oh, you can. Okay, thank you. Yes, I'd like to say that it's been a very insightful presentations from our speakers. I personally did not get a chance to ask a question or to say anything, but I do feel that the relationship between Africa and China has been more of a business kind of relationship to a large extent. Because of the negotiation skills of our governments, in the previous, the British and the Europeans exploited Africa in ways, and if we are not careful, the same thing will happen in this dispensation. So we need our governments to come forward and actually negotiate deals that benefit us rather than China, because China is looking after its own interests, and therefore it will always try to negotiate the best terms that suit their needs, especially as Africa has a lot of raw materials, resources, which China needs, and that is basically one of the biggest interests of China in Africa. Thank you all very much for attending the seminar, and I'd like to say thank you to the technical crew as well for making all this possible, and we look forward to seeing you in our next webinar, which as Yokiam already said will be in October. So from me and from all the people here, I'd like to say thank you and bye-bye.
Actually, Mr. President, pardon me. I forgot to, this is my fault. I did not acknowledge our other members that are already on ground with you. For those who started joining this webinar late, some of our members are in the UK right now celebrating our first year anniversary of this network. And we just start, and I must acknowledge those that are there right now, especially our good brother, Mukeli. He's our translator from French to English. He's been doing a great job doing that. And also I'd like to thank, if they would say anything, we have the vice president and our treasurer. They're there on ground in the UK. I don't know, one day you want to say something really quick before we close out.
I actually wanted to use the opportunity to say a big thank you to and of his heart to us and to ARN. He has spoiled us with very nice, delicious meals and some very nice drinks also to celebrate the first anniversary of ARN. So thank you very much, Prof, for not just opening the door of your house, your heart to us, but for lending us your wisdom in ARN and for all your support and encouragement to us.
Thank you very much.
Yes, and I just want to say thank you to the directors for once again choosing such an essential topic and creating such an exciting question that can really bring a really broad range of African scholars together to try and tackle these immensely important questions. So thank you to the directors.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you so much to our guest speakers. You've done a great job and we appreciate your time. May you do great things with your work. And we look forward to keeping in touch with you. And thank you. In my context, when you express, the best way to express yourself of gratitude using your body is by doing this. Thank you so much. Mungode. Osoko, thank you. All right, take care of yourselves, and we look forward to seeing you during our next webinar. Take care.